Good day. Today is Sunday, 2nd March 2025, and the European leaders, or to be more precise, Prime Minister Starmer of Britain and French President Macron, appear at the moment to be trying to pick up the pieces of the diplomatic disaster they experienced last week. Their failed trips to Washington, D.C., their failed attempts to sway Donald Trump to give their troops, if they are ever sent to Ukraine, military guarantees, and of course the absolute catastrophe of Vladimir Zelensky's trip to Washington and the disastrous meeting that took place in the Oval Office, which ended in basically a shouting match between Zelensky on the one hand and Donald Trump and J.D. Vance on the other. Now, before I proceed with this program, there is something I want to again make clear. I've said it in many places and many venues, but in many programs on this channel. I've also said it on the Duran as well, and I think nonetheless it bears repeating. There is a narrative that is floating around the world. You see it every day in the media. The Financial Times and The Guardian plug it constantly in Britain. You get it also in some parts of the European media as well. And, well, even people, I think, many of them in independent media, are drawn along with it, into it as well. There is a narrative that there is an ongoing negotiation between the United States and Russia underway, that this negotiation is seeking to end the conflict in Ukraine, that the Americans and the Russians are talking about how to end the conflict, and that the Ukrainians themselves are excluded from these negotiations, as supposedly are the Europeans. So the narrative is that, rather in the style of Yalta or of the 19th century great powers, which often decided between themselves where borders were to be determined in Europe and that kind of thing, often with minimal consultation with the people of the countries whose borders they were changing and agreeing between them. Anyway, the narrative that is being spread is that the Russians and the Americans are doing all that all over again. That is, Stalin and Churchill, or Stalin and Roosevelt, all over again, sitting down together, drawing the map of Europe, redrawing the map of Europe, without the Europeans being consulted, without the Ukrainians being consulted. I should say, and very briefly, that I don't think Stalin and Roosevelt ever did any such thing, and I don't think Churchill and Stalin ever seriously did that kind of thing either. But I'm not going to spend time talking about the diplomatic history of the Second World War. My point is that I have seen absolutely no evidence, no public evidence, that a discussion of that kind between the Russians and the Americans is in fact underway. Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin had a telephone call, a telephone conversation which lasted 90 minutes and which appears to have covered lots of different topics, of which one, of course, was Ukraine. There are some similarities in position. The Americans, Donald Trump, have effectively ruled out NATO membership for Ukraine. Now, I've already explained that this is probably unacceptable, or at least insufficient for the Russians, given that they must have doubts about whether Donald Trump can bind future administrations on this issue. But nonetheless, that does create a point of understanding between the Americans and the Russians. And of course, the United States has a decisive and legitimate word in whether Ukraine joins NATO or not. Here I'm just going to, by the way, address a further narrative point that constantly is harped on about, which gives the impression that countries like Ukraine have some sort of right to join NATO, and that it's not for other countries like Russia, for example, to impose vetoes upon their doing so. Well, the Russians do have a right to strongly object to Ukraine joining NATO, and they have done so in many venues and many occasions. And they've also said that it is for them a red line, and that if that red line is crossed, consequences will follow. And, well, we've seen the consequences with the special military operation. Though the Russians are always at pains to point out that Ukraine's NATO membership, though one of the most important factors in bringing about the question of Ukraine's NATO membership, though one of the most important factors in bringing about the special military operation, is far from being the only one. But coming back to the topic of Ukraine's NATO membership, yes, Ukraine has a right to apply to join NATO, but it does not have a right to join NATO. The NATO powers must all agree before that can happen, and the United States has a right to refuse to agree to Ukraine joining NATO. This is a point which hardly anyone ever makes, but it is a point that, of course, is starting to gain relevance now, given that Donald Trump is ruling out Ukraine's NATO membership. Anyway, moving on. There are commonalities of position between the Americans and the Russians about Ukraine. But there are also lots of issues that could be talked about. The borders, where the borders would be between Russia and Ukraine, how much of what was Ukraine the Russians expect to gain control over, the future status of the Russian language inside Ukraine, the status of the Russian Orthodox Church, all of those many matters which the Russians bring up all the time. Now, so far, to my knowledge, there's been no discussion between the Americans and the Russians about any of those questions at all. And the public position of the American government, something that Donald Trump has himself set out on many occasions, is that this is an issue, these issues, the agreement about how to end the war, is not something that the United States is seeking to negotiate bilaterally with the Russians. It is something that the Ukrainians and the Russians must agree to with each other. Trump has been talking about ending the war. He's talked about a ceasefire, something which, by the way, the Russians categorically reject. But the point is, he wants negotiations between the Russians and the Ukrainians to begin right away, as soon as possible. The Russians have repeatedly said that they are ready for such negotiations. As I've discussed in many places, sometimes Zelensky gives the impression that he too is prepared to engage in negotiations. But as he demonstrated over the course of his trip to the United States and over the course of that stormy encounter in the Oval Office, he doesn't really mean it. He is always looking for ways to evade that which he appears to be promising. So, there are, as far as I know, no bilateral negotiations underway between the Americans and the Russians about Ukraine. If such negotiations are taking place, then I don't know who is conducting them. I don't know of any Russian or American officials who are meeting to conduct those negotiations, or where those negotiations are supposed to be happening. And bear in mind, if there were face-to-face meetings between the Americans and the Russians to discuss Ukraine, and it's difficult to see how, if such a bilateral negotiation were really underway, I myself cannot see how it could be conducted without face-to-face meetings. I would have thought by now the fact would have leaked out. I would also have thought by now that we would know a little about who the participants in those discussions are. Now, having said that, there are discussions between the Americans and the Russians. I have had some information about this. These discussions are not, so far as I can tell, discussions about settling the conflict in Ukraine. Again, the same source who gets his information from the Russian parliament has been in contact with me. He's said that some US officials have been in contact with other Russian officials. These are, to stress again, they're not negotiations. They have informed the Russians of the talking points, the matters that concern the United States and which might be a topic of future discussion between those two great powers, if and when they can properly meet and start talking about these things. And according to this person, the priority issue that the Americans are bringing up is not, in fact, even Ukraine. It is the status of the dollar, the position of the dollar in the global system. The United States is becoming increasingly concerned about the development of the BRICS, about whether the new financial arrangements that BRICS might be setting up could evolve into some kind of alternative currency system or some sort of long-term challenge to the position of the dollar. And the Americans want to understand from the Russians what these mechanisms are all about, what kind of challenge to the dollar in the long term they might pose. And apparently the Americans have even brought up with the Russians the question of whether the United States might itself at some point have some entry into the financial and trading mechanisms that the BRICS states are setting up. So that apparently is a key issue of concern for the Americans. The Americans have also been asking the Russians questions about Russia's relationship with Iran. They're nervous, apparently, about the energy deals that Iran and Russia are concluding with each other. They want to know what those are all about. And unsurprisingly, the Americans are also apparently concerned about Russia's relations with China. And again, they want some explanation and some insight from the Russians about what that is all about as well. I will talk about all of this later in this program. But to repeat again, even these points are not negotiations. They are the kind of things that come up in exploratory discussions when two great powers start resuming contacts with each other. They are, in effect, talking points with the Americans signaling to the Russians what their long-term concerns are. But to reiterate again, we are not getting any negotiations so far on any one of these topics between the Americans and the Russians, and we are not seeing at the moment any negotiations between the Russians and the Americans to directly settle the conflict in Ukraine. Trump has repeatedly said that it is the Ukrainians and the Russians who need to talk. And I don't see why we shouldn't take him at his word about this. He's also said some other things. NATO entry for Ukraine is ruled out. As I said, that is an issue about which the United States is entirely within its rights to take a position as a country that has to consent to Ukraine's NATO membership, and which, if Ukraine were to become a member of NATO, would have to defend Ukraine in the event that Ukraine were attacked. And secondly, Trump has also made some very clear points about the question of security guarantees, his unwillingness to provide any, in fact, his point-blank refusal up to now to provide any, and his absolute position that American troops must not be involved in any matter relating to the security of Ukraine. Something which, again, to repeat, is fully within the United States' right to take a position about. Now, I say all of this because apparently the European powers, as I said, are now busy meeting with each other. And we hear Prime Minister Starmer of Britain has in fact just said that the Europeans are preparing to put forward an alternative plan for peace in Ukraine, which they are going to present to Donald Trump. Now, there's been a lot of discussion about whether the Americans have a plan to settle the conflict in Ukraine. The Russian Deputy Foreign Minister, Sergei Ryabkov, says that the Americans have never presented to the Russians a plan to settle the conflict in Ukraine. Given, as I said, that the entire American position up to now presupposes a negotiation between the Russians and the Ukrainians, it is perhaps unsurprising that the Americans have not presented the Russians with a plan to settle the conflict in Ukraine. That's not to say, by the way, that if the Russians and the Ukrainians don't sit down and start negotiating, the United States will not have an interest in how those negotiations are conducted. In the event that such negotiations do take place, inevitably the United States will have to be involved because it will have to underwrite those negotiations in some form, and quite plausibly it will want to play a role in shaping those negotiations. But for the moment, I don't see why the United States needs to present a plan when its entire objective is to get the Russians and the Ukrainians talking to each other. But of course, the Europeans take a different line. They complain that the Americans and the Russians are talking to each other about Ukraine, even though, as I've said, I see no evidence of this. And the Europeans appear to assume that the Americans have some kind of plan, though nobody can say what that plan is, though one does hear dark words about Ukraine being forced by the Americans into some sort of capitulation. Of course, it might also come to that. But now Starmer is saying that the Europeans are going to come up with a plan, an actual plan of their own, some kind of alternative plan, agreed, by the way, with Kiev, which they're going to put to the Americans. And Starmer is now presiding in London today over a meeting of 18 European states. Notice, by the way, that it is exclusively European states that are being asked to participate in these meetings. Again, it appears to be lost in Europe. It's completely forgotten in London that there are other stakeholders in the world as well apart from Russia, Europe, and the United States, that there are other countries in the world. Again, I've been reading more articles today, for example, about how the United States, how Donald Trump have recently ended Russia's state of isolation. There is another completely incorrect or factually wrong article, at least as far as I could see, in the Daily Telegraph about the state of the Russian economy, which again talks about Russia being internationally isolated. These comments again show that there is no awareness on the part of some people, in Europe especially, about the fact that there is another world out there, that China, India, Brazil are today great powers, or at least aspiring great powers, that they have a major say in the international system. There is, for example, the grouping called Friends of Peace, which was set up a few months ago at the UN, and its leading members are China, Brazil, and South Africa, all BRICS member states. They've all expressed views and opinions about the conflict in Ukraine. Some of them have taken steps to try to push the sides towards a settlement of that conflict. These are very important powers. Over the last couple of days, Russia has had a meeting with the representatives of these three powers, and they've discussed with these three powers the state of the discussions that are taking place with the Americans up to now. So there are these countries too, but notice that Keir Starmer is not inviting them to London. Brazil, China, South Africa are not coming to London. They're not going to participate in the discussions that are going to take place there. It is exclusively European states that will do so. Well, anyway, 18 states apparently, all of the big European states, Germany, France, Italy, Spain, they will be there. Some of the smaller ones have been excluded. The Baltic states, to their extreme annoyance, for example, have been excluded as well. And, well, Starmer tells us that he's going to try and cook up some kind of victory plan, or at least, some kind of peace plan, not victory plan. We'll come to what it actually is after this discussion, or as an outgrowth of this discussion. Now, this meeting should be seen in some respects as a sequel to the Paris meeting that Emmanuel Macron convened about 2 weeks ago now, in which was hurriedly cobbled together by Macron in the aftermath of Donald Trump's telephone call to Putin, the comments in Ramstein and Munich by US Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth and US Vice President J.D. Vance, and also the spat, the actually rather angry exchange that took place between Zelensky and Trump, and the famous post on Truth Social in which Trump referred to Zelensky as a dictator. Anyway, that meeting, as I said, took place about 2 weeks ago now. It was all about putting together a European force to send to Ukraine. The other European member states, most of them, apart from Britain and France, were far from keen. The new German, well, the man who will soon be Germany's Chancellor, Friedrich Merz, has, by the way, on behalf of Germany, again expressed skepticism about this idea. So it looks as if the German position on this is not going to change as a result of the change of government that is apparently developing in Germany. But anyway, it looks as if this meeting is intended as I said, to try and revive that proposal, which received a devastating knock over the course of last week. Because at the Paris meeting, Starmer admitted that the plan would only be workable if the Americans were prepared to give what Starmer described as some kind of a backstop, that the Americans would be prepared to provide the Europeans, those European states that were providing the military forces to go to Ukraine, that the Americans would agree to provide air cover, logistical support, intelligence support, guarantees, in other words, that if the Europeans really did find themselves in trouble in Ukraine, the Americans would come to their rescue. I've discussed in many places what a reckless plan that is, how in fact it is clearly a device to draw the United States into a confrontation with Russia. If a European force of that kind were indeed deployed to Ukraine, with the Americans having made those kind of promises and guarantees, then as night follows day, the Ukrainians would arrange for violations of the ceasefire, which, as night follows day, would be blamed by the European media, and in fact large parts of the American media as well, would be blamed on the Russians. There would be conflict and fighting, and at that point the Ukrainians, the British and the French would come along and tell the Americans, you must now come to our rescue. That's what you promised to do. That is why our troops were able to go. That is why they're there. And if you don't do it, you've broken your promises to us. You violated the security pledges that you have given. And at that point, the NATO alliance will finally and conclusively collapse. So that is what you must now do. That is the plan. It is straightforward as that. That is what the British and the French have been up to. And, well, as I said, it didn't really come off fully in Paris, but Macron and Starmer and Zelensky coordinated with each other. And Macron went to the United States last week and met with Donald Trump and tried to get promises for these guarantees for the peacekeeping forces from Donald Trump and failed. And then Starmer followed on Thursday and tried to do the same thing all over again and also failed. So what is the purpose then of this meeting, given that all this failed last week? Well, the first thing to understand about this meeting that's taking place in London today, in Lancaster House, by the way, which is a palatial building in London, which the British government regularly uses for important conferences. It dates from the 18th century. It's extremely opulent, far more opulent than most buildings that the British government uses in London. Just saying. Anyway, what then is the purpose of this meeting? The first thing to understand about it is that Starmer and Macron basically put this meeting together. They decided to convene this meeting not in the aftermath of the collapse of Zelensky's talks with Trump on Friday, as has now been put about. This meeting that is taking place today was already originally organized at the beginning of last week in anticipation that Trump and the Americans, over the course of Macron's and Starmer's and Zelensky's visits, would be talked into giving some kind of backstop or guarantee to the British, the French, and ultimately the Ukrainians. So the idea was Starmer and Macron would come back from Washington with a security guarantee, a pledge of military support and backing from the United States. Zelensky would then sign off on the minerals extraction deal, which would draw the United States further into Ukraine. That is its purpose. And then there would be the follow-up meeting on Sunday, at which the details of the security plan of the peacekeeping force, or the reassurance force, as it's sometimes called, would be drawn up and agreed between the European member states. And then, well, there would be, at some point, maybe on Zelensky's part, a declaration of some kind of unilateral ceasefire or something like that. Zelensky would then agree directly with the British and the French and the Europeans for the deployment of this peacekeeping or reassurance force, which is, as I said, in truth, none of those things. And, well, the scenario that I've just set up, the unilateral breaches of the ceasefire by the Russians, according to the Ukrainians, the arranged breaches of the ceasefire, all of those things, all of that would then happen with the result that I've discussed. The United States would find itself in an impossible position where it either reneged on guarantees and promises of support which it appeared to have given, creating a massive crisis in its entire alliance system, or went head-to-head with the Russians, as Macron, Starmer, and Zelensky all want, in a conflict in Ukraine. So that was the original purpose of this meeting. But with the failure of the diplomacy of last week, the European diplomacy of last week, this meeting is now in disarray. All of these people are coming to London. Meloni, Scholz, by the way, again, he's still the Chancellor. The Merz, I understand, will also be there. Annalena Baerbock, I believe, is still coming, as is Boris Pistorius. They'll all be there from Germany. Macron, of course, will be there. Sanchez from Spain will be there. As I said, Meloni from Italy will also be there. And, well, they have not yet got that promise, that backstop from the Americans. And after the events on Friday and the failure of the various meetings that took place last week, it's looking increasingly unlikely that that will happen. So what are these people now talking about? Well, again, we see that it's basically the same plan being repackaged in a different way. Starmer and Macron and the Europeans are going to float what they're going to call a peace plan. They're going to take it to the Americans, and the peace plan will be essentially the same thing, the same outline that I've talked about already. Some kind of perfunctory negotiation with the Russians, but all on the basis of the Americans giving some kind of guarantee and backstop to the Ukrainians and to the Europeans deploying their forces to Ukraine, and all of the scenarios that I've just outlined playing out in exactly the way that I've discussed. And if you want to know what the ultimate objective of all of this is, well, you can get this from an editorial which has appeared in The Guardian today. This is that ultimately it's the same plan as always. The Europeans, the British, the French, they all want ultimately one and the same thing, which is to get a agreement, or at least to get a treaty, which will result in the strategic defeat of Russia. The Observer editorial finishes with these really quite extraordinary words which sets out the objective quite clearly. The starting point for any peace in Ukraine must be to recognize the illegality of Putin's aggressions, which began with the annexation of Crimea in 2014. Ukraine should have a seat at the table in all discussions, free from threats and extortion from Trump and his allies. The aim of those discussions should be to see both the full withdrawal of Russian forces and powerful guarantees for Kiev's security. At this moment of dark reckoning, we owe it not only to the people of Ukraine, we owe it to ourselves. In other words, Zelensky's peace plan, total capitulation by the Russians, policed by European forces, backed by the United States, and ultimately irreversible membership of Ukraine into NATO. No different from the plan that Zelensky has outlined in the past, his so-called peace plan. That remains the British, French, European and Ukrainian objective. Now, of course, The Guardian is not the British government, and this editorial is not a British government statement. But The Guardian is the newspaper most closely aligned with the Starmer government. Its views on most issues correspond very closely to those of the Starmer government. There is considerable briefing of people in The Guardian by members of the Starmer cabinet. That goes on all of the time. And given how closely these words correlate with Starmer's public statements and those of other British officials, such as David Lammy, I see no reason to doubt that this is exactly the objective that the British continue to set for themselves. Now, it is an objective which has no basis in reality. Whether you can talk if you wish about the illegality of Putin's aggressions, but the Russians are not going to withdraw or give up Crimea. They're not going to withdraw from Donbass. They are not going to agree to these sort of proposals. We'll come to what the Russians are saying about all of this in a moment, because they've said more. The Russians are not going to agree to any of this. And putting this forward in a plan to the Russians guarantees rejection. It guarantees a prolongation of the war, which is precisely the opposite of what Donald Trump says and his team say they want to achieve. So here we see a peace plan being cobbled together and floated all over again, ultimately with the same objective: to involve the United States in the Ukraine conflict, which is precisely what the Americans say they don't want to do. And if that cannot be achieved, then in effect to make negotiations between any of the parties in the conflict impossible, to prolong the war still further beyond its present state, and to bring any process of negotiation to an end, but to do so in a way that would be unacceptable, or at least in a way that could be spun to throw the blame upon the Russians. Well, the Russians, as I said, have been speaking about all of this, and the person who has been speaking most clearly about this is Lavrov. And he's discussed this in an interview he's given to the Russian newspaper Krasnaya Zvezda, Red Star, which is the official newspaper of the Russian Ministry of Defense, just saying. And we have quotations from the Russian news agency TASS about what he said in this interview. He said President Macron is running around with some ideas, as is Prime Minister Starmer. They are preparing so many thousands of peacekeepers and will provide them with air cover. This is impertinent. This plan to introduce peacekeepers into Ukraine is continuing to incite Kiev for a war against us. First of all, no one is asking us. President Trump understands everything. He said it was too early to say when there will be a settlement. You can discuss this issue, but the agreement of the parties is needed. He is behaving correctly. Notice the word, the agreement of the parties. Ukraine and Russia, they're not negotiating at the moment. Trump has not been able to get the Ukrainians to agree to sit down and to conduct negotiations with the Russians. And the Russians, again, are making it very clear that all the terms of the negotiations, including any notional ideas of introducing peacekeepers into Ukraine, something which the Russians, by the way, have consistently opposed, peacekeepers from any part of the world, not just Europe. As I said, the topic of bringing peacekeepers into Ukraine, I can remember it being floated during the many, many tortuous discussions that took place to try to enforce the Minsk agreement. And the Russians always rejected it outright. And I see no reason to think that they're going to change their position. Anyway, the point is that there's been no discussion. The Russians have not been consulted about it. The Russians reject this entire idea out of hand, and the purpose of the plan is to continue to incite Kiev to continue the war. Lavrov has actually been saying lots of other things as well, by the way. He's been he's given quite a lot of his thoughts to Krasnaya Zvezda. He talked about what exactly is it that these peacekeepers are supposed to do if they are in Ukraine. When we ask these thinkers, this means the Europeans, what will hypothetically happen to the part that they take under their control, means the part of Ukraine, they say nothing would happen. Ukraine will remain there. I asked one person, will the Russian language be banned there? He said nothing. They cannot utter a word of condemnation of what happened. No other language has been subjected to such aggression. Imagine if French or German were banned in Switzerland or English in Ireland. The Irish want a little self-determination. If they tried to ban English now, they would shake the whole United Nations by its pillars, and the British would demand that Ireland be condemned. But here in Ukraine, it's possible. You tell them to their face and they don't react. So that's what Lavrov said. Clearly, there's been some discussion, or at least Lavrov here is saying that the Russians have had some words with the Europeans about this. Presumably, and I'm going to guess here that these thoughts were conveyed to Orban, who, as far as I know, is the only European official with whom the Russians have discussed these things. But anyway, the point is that the Russians are saying that European peacekeepers are supposed to be going to Ukraine, and they don't address any of the issues which the Russians have set out, which are important to them and which form part of the objectives that the Russians set out in their special military operation. And, well, Lavrov had further things to say. He said that most of the problems in the world originate in Europe, and they don't ever seem to end, and the way that the Europeans are behaving shows that the Europeans still can't accept or understand that there are other ways of doing things other than with this constant rivalry and power plays that you see in Europe. He also contrasted the common sense, as he put it, of the Trump team with what became before, with Biden and his people, and what the Europeans are currently up to. But anyway, his key point is that peacekeepers, all of this is completely unacceptable. The Russians have been repeatedly saying as much. Bringing up this topic simply prolongs this war, and pressing on with it, trying to get the Americans to give guarantees, by the way, which even the Biden team never gave. It's important to remember that the United States, throughout the entire period of Joe Biden's administration, was never asked and never gave these sort of guarantees to Ukraine, the guarantees that Starmer and Macron are now talking about. Anyway, all of these devices for trying to get security guarantees from the Americans in this kind of context, ultimately, they are incredibly dangerous. And when Lavrov talks about the Trump team's common sense, I suspect that he is noting the fact that the Americans themselves seem to recognize the dangers inherent in all of this, and the Russians probably also noticed Trump's comments about the fact that Zelensky, who, as I said, is fully a party to all of these all these machinations, the fact that he's gambling with World War III. Now, well, we will see what's going to happen over the next few weeks. I'm going to say straight away that I cannot imagine that the Americans, who clearly refused to give security guarantees to the Europeans and to the Ukrainians last week, are now in any mood to give them, especially not after the blow-up that took place in the Oval Office on Friday. There is an article in The Guardian by the British journalist Patrick Winborn, who is Patrick Wintor, who is The Guardian's diplomatic editor, who is perhaps one of the few rational people left in Britain discussing the Ukraine conflict. Though I say that with, I'm not going to say more. Anyway, he makes the point that after the Trump-Zelensky spat, Starmer may not have many cards left to play on Ukraine. And he goes on to say, as Keir Starmer surveys the wreckage of the US-Ukrainian relationship caused by the Oval Office fight, the Prime Minister is clearly intent on trying to repair the diplomatic damage, but it may be that the mood of mutual antagonism, not just in the US, but in Europe, is too great. And he then goes on to say that despite the decent atmospherics, that's one way of describing it, Starmer, in common with Emmanuel Macron earlier in the week, could not extract the one concession he wanted: a clear US commitment to provide security guarantees, principally air cover and intelligence, for a European force being prepared to oversee a ceasefire inside Ukraine. Trump continued to insist he trusted Putin to abide by the ceasefire and focused on the concessions Ukraine was going to have to make. And so now, when as many as, he says 12 European leaders, but I gather the actual figure is 18, gather in London, Starmer will have to lead a conversation on whether Trump's mind is made up, or whether the president's mood swings can, even at this late stage, lead to a reconciliation. I don't myself believe that they can do. I don't see, by the way, any inconsistency between what Trump said over the course of his meeting with Zelensky and what Trump has been saying for the last year, and in everything that he has said since his inauguration. I don't really see these shifts and eddies of policy that people imagine. I don't know where they find them. So I don't see why Trump would change his position on any of this, given that, as the Americans have made crystal clear, their objective is to draw down their forces in Europe, to de-escalate the situation with the Russians, to establish or achieve some level of normalization in relations with the Russians, so that they can start to redeploy their forces to face other challenges, most importantly that of China in the Asia-Pacific region. I'll come to China shortly in this program. So I don't see why the Americans would want to change their position here, why the Americans would want to change their mind. Bear in mind that if the Americans were to give the Europeans the kind of guarantees, the sort of backstop that the Europeans have been trying to get, this commitment to provide intelligence and air cover for the European peacekeeping forces in Ukraine, the American presence in Europe not only would not be reduced, it would almost certainly have to grow. The US would be taking on an active commitment in Europe. It would, in effect, be engaging in enforcing some sort of no-fly zone against Ukraine. People talk about providing air cover to the European forces in Ukraine. But air cover has to mean American aircraft flying over Ukrainian airspace. And it's difficult to see how that can happen alongside the Russian aircraft apparently doing the same thing. It would be a very, very dangerous situation if it was otherwise. So we are very close. We would almost, in fact, be in a position where we would be looking at an American no-fly zone or an American enforced no-fly zone over the enormous territory of Ukraine. Of course, the Russians would never agree to that. But let's say such a scenario were ever to take place, it would require an enormous commitment of American air power to make it effective. American air power, which the Americans are anxious, or so they say, to redeploy to the Asia-Pacific. As I said, I cannot imagine that the Americans, if they're consistent with their policies, would ever agree to this. So, again, it seems to me that Starmer and Macron and the other European leaders are drifting towards a further dispute with the Americans. And here I get to say something else. Macron and Starmer were treated very courteously by the Trump people when they came to Washington last week. The events of Friday, the quarrel, the public row between Zelensky and the Americans in the Oval Office should act as a warning that coming back to the Americans again and again with the same proposal, the proposal which the Americans are repeatedly refusing. All of this, by the way, being conducted simultaneously with what are obviously government-sponsored media campaigns against the American government that are playing out in Europe. At some point, it's likely that American anger over this will boil over. And just as we saw on Friday, we could have a situation where things degenerate into the kind of row that Zelensky has just been exposed to, when the Americans finally have enough. Now, on the question of Zelensky's row with Trump and Vance, there continues to be this relentless narrative that is circling, especially in Europe, but you also see it in some places in the United States, about the ambush that Vance and Trump supposedly laid for Zelensky over the course of that public Oval Office meeting. Now, I have to say, I never thought this was the case. When I did my program yesterday, I'd only seen parts of the conversation, parts of the row that took place in the Oval Office, but I've now watched the entire 50 minutes of this meeting, this public meeting that took place in the Oval Office with the media apparently there. Well, the media obviously there. Now, I'm not going to set out what I think of this because there's actually a really good commentary about this on X, and it's by Richard Hanania. And I don't know who Mr. Richard Hanania is, but this post on X has been cited by many people. And according to Mr. Hanania himself, he is or has been a fan of Zelensky's up to this point, and nobody could possibly describe me as that. So take this from him if you're not prepared to take it from me. I'm going to read out this post because, as I said, I think this provides the best and most conclusive take on what happened over the course of that Oval Office meeting. As I said, it's from Richard Hanania. I watched the entire press conference with Zelensky. There was 40 minutes of discussion up to the argument. Most people saw at most the last 10 minutes. The whole video gives the proper context. When I first watched the argument without the proper context, I thought it was possible that Trump and Vance ambushed Zelensky or were even trying to humiliate him. That's not what happened. You had 40 minutes of calm conversation. Vance made a point that didn't attack Zelensky and wasn't even addressed to him, and Zelensky clearly started the argument. In the first 40 minutes, Zelensky kept trying to go beyond what was negotiated in the deal. That's obviously the minerals extraction deal. When Trump asked a question, it was always, "We'll see." Zelensky made blanket assertions that there would be no negotiating with Putin and that Russia would pay for the war. When Trump said that it was a tragedy that people on both sides were dying, Zelensky interjected that the Russians were the invaders. For his part, Trump made clear that the United States would continue delivering military aid. All Zelensky had to do was remain calm for a few more minutes and they would have signed a deal. The argument started when Trump pointed out that it would be hard to make a deal if you talk about Putin the way Zelensky does. Vance interjects to make the reasonable point that Biden called Putin names, and that didn't get us anywhere. The Zelensky-Trump dynamic was calm and stable. It was when Vance spoke that Zelensky started to interrogate him. Throughout the press conference to that point, everyone was making their arguments directly to the audience. Zelensky decided to challenge Vance and ask him hostile questions. He went back to his point that Putin never sticks to ceasefires, once again implying that negotiations are pointless. Why on earth would you do this? Then came the fight we all saw. Zelensky was minutes away from being home free, and he would have had the deal and new commitments of the Trump administration. The point Vance made was directed against Biden and the media, taking them to task for speaking in moralistic terms. This offended Zelensky, and that began the argument. I've been a fan of Zelensky up to this point. that this showed so much incompetence, if not emotional instability, that I don't see how he recovers from this. The relationship with the administration is broken. Ukraine should probably go with new leadership at this point. Well, I have to say, Richard Hanania might have been a fan of Zelensky's. As I said, I have never been. I said before the meeting took place, I thought there was at least a possibility that Zelensky might throw a scene. And of course, he took the first opportunity to do just that. The Americans wanted to deal with him courteously. They wanted to sign the minerals deal, the minerals extractions deal with him. I've now been told, by the way, that in Trump's mind, the primary purpose of getting Zelensky to sign the deal is that it was seen as a commitment from Zelensky to peace in Ukraine. It was Zelensky, the Americans felt that if Zelensky did sign the deal, it would be a sign that he did actually want to achieve peace in Ukraine, since it's only with peace that the deal could come into effect. Zelensky interjecting, behaving rudely, behaving aggressively, convinced the Americans that his heart is not really in the deal, and that he does not want peace in Ukraine. That's my understanding of what the Americans ultimately were all about. It's all been explained to me, by the way, and I think this is probably right. So there was no ambush by Trump and Vance of Zelensky. It's just that Zelensky coming up endlessly with the same talking points, constantly shifting position, making unhelpful interjections, giving every impression that he wasn't happy with the deal, wasn't happy with the fact that it didn't come with the security guarantees that he wanted, wasn't happy even with the idea of negotiations with the Russians. He even rejected the Trump proposal for a ceasefire, which is what the Americans have been trying to work towards. He said he'll only agree to a ceasefire if he gets these American security guarantees, which, as I said, the Americans are not prepared to give. This solidified the American view that Zelensky was not interested in peace. Now, what Prime Minister Starmer and Emmanuel Macron need to understand is that if they go on doing the same thing all over again, coming back to Washington, making the same proposals for European forces to be sent to Ukraine, which is a European idea, by the way, not an American one, harping on about security guarantees. Starmer talked about the fact that there were intense discussions for security guarantees, though he didn't make it clear. He said that today. He didn't make it clear who those discussions were with. Just saying. Anyway, there is a possibility that just as happened with Zelensky on Friday, American anger will finally boil over, and the Americans will tell Starmer and Macron to get lost. Now, that has happened before. In 1956, as every British Prime Minister should know, the British and the French got themselves involved in an adventure in Egypt, a military adventure in Egypt. They went far beyond any possible agreement with the Americans about this. The Americans were furious about it. President Eisenhower reacted incredibly negatively, and the Americans, in the end, acted extremely sharply and brought the entire project, the entire British and French project, to a juddering stop in a way that basically ended the then British Prime Minister Anthony Eden's political career. Now, why Prime Minister Starmer would be inviting that same fate upon himself, I really cannot understand. Perhaps it's worth pointing out that though America's position in the world is arguably, in fact definitely, significantly less strong than it was in 1956. In 1956, the United States was indisputably the world's leading nuclear, military, and industrial power. The Soviet Union was far behind the United States in all of those areas at that time. Britain's position relative to the United States was much stronger in 1956 than it is today. Britain in 1956 was still a major industrial power. It had a significant and large technological base. It had very large armed forces. And though the jewel in the crown, India, had been lost, well, the British Empire still spanned the world. In 1956, Britain could still act the role of a great power, even though that power was draining away. Today, Britain has none of that. It is in no position to play the kind of role that it still could aspire to play to some degree in 1956. If the British going up against the Americans ended in badly for them in 1956, how much worse would it end if the Americans put their foot down this time, given that American power relative to British power has grown so much greater? I'm going to say something else here, which is a personal observation that I am making now as a British citizen. Britain's economic position is not good. There are potential further tax increases or spending cuts pending in a few weeks' time because the government has lost its fiscal headroom. Starmer has had to renege on another of his election promises. By the way, this is a point about Starmer. Starmer repeatedly goes back on promises and pledges that he has made in the past. He's done this constantly in domestic politics. He won the Labour leadership, claiming to be a friend and disciple of Jeremy Corbyn's and saying that he would abide strictly with all of the various key points of Jeremy Corbyn's programme. He then promptly pushed Jeremy Corbyn out of the Labour Party, sacked most of Corbyn's people, and then reversed completely all the positions that Corbyn had previously taken. He just reversed his position on the British budget. He spoke about the importance of overseas aid. He's just cut overseas aid to, I think it's around 0.3% of GDP. I read somewhere that in real terms it's closer to 0.15% of GDP. All of this is justified on the basis of an increase in defence spending, which, as I discussed in a recent programme, would achieve nothing. Anyway, Starmer has again reversed his position on an election pledge. He might have to reverse his positions on more election pledges shortly, given the fiscal problems that Britain is facing. Why is he spending so much time on Ukraine? Why is he giving all of this time and energy to Ukraine? He went, as I said, to the United States yesterday. He's been spending a huge amount of his time cobbling plans about an intervention force and that kind of thing. I read somewhere in actually an article that was sympathetic to him that Starmer spends routinely around half his time on foreign affairs, on international relations, rather than on British domestic matters, which I think is an absolute first for any Prime Minister. Isn't it time that he actually focused instead on governing Britain, on addressing the many and growing problems that Britain faces, rather than working overtime to put British troops in danger by sending them to Ukraine and risking relations with the Americans? Just saying. Anyway, that, it seems to me, the risk that's inherent in what Starmer is trying to do. Up to now, the Americans have treated him with courtesy, as they treated Macron with courtesy. I don't think that Trump and Vance actually, in reality, have that much time for Starmer. I think that they are, to some extent, working along with the British because, well, Britain has been a long-standing ally and all of that. But as the Americans showed in 1956, as this administration showed in the encounter with Zelensky on Friday, the Americans are pushed too far. They're not going to hold back, and they will take tough action to put Britain in its place, as they would see it. And I don't know why Starmer thinks Zelensky, of all people, is so important that he wants to risk all of that. I say that Zelensky has just had this furious row with the Americans in Washington. Trump was clearly very, very angry. J.D. Vance, who's always been a skeptic about the war, I think he was more than angry. I think he was absolutely furious. I'm going to say this. I mean, whatever else, whatever hopes there may be that Zelensky might eventually be able to patch things up with Trump, I suspect that after what happened on Friday, Zelensky now has a permanent enemy in Washington, in the very powerful figure of the US Vice President, J.D. Vance. Elon Musk has been busy posting further comments on X, which also make it absolutely clear that he has no time for Zelensky at all and sides fully with Vance on this quarrel. And then what does Starmer do? Directly after this event, he not only utters words of support for Zelensky. Well, you could perhaps forgive that. All of the European leaders in unison did. It was quite bizarre watching, actually. He actually embraced him. He actually embraced Zelensky, of all people, outside Downing Street. He didn't need to do that. He didn't need to go that far. But he did. Directly after Zelensky had made the Americans so completely furious. Now, what makes this even more bizarre is that apparently the British know that Zelensky ignored advice from Trump officials about how he should conduct himself in his meeting with Trump. There's an article about all of this in The Guardian. Again, The Guardian, always note that it's The Guardian that tells us these things. They say Trump officials fume at Zelensky for disregarding advice before the meeting. Officials say mineral deal would serve as commitment to US security guarantee. By the way, this article is not based on any discussions with Trump officials. It's based on information provided to The Guardian by people familiar with the matter. In other words, members of Starmer's government. Again, they're trying to weave this into a discussion about security guarantees. Whereas, in fact, what Trump clearly said over the course of the meeting with Zelensky, and that is that Ukraine would not need security guarantees. The mere presence of the Americans in Ukraine would in itself serve some kind of guarantee of American security. But anyway, we go on to read that inside the White House, officials blame the Ukrainian President Zelensky for the meltdown in the Oval Office on Friday. Meltdown, by the way, is an expression used by my colleague and friend Alex Christoforou to describe Zelensky's behavior. Could it be that some people have been listening to his programs, just saying, and expressed frustration that he pushed for security guarantees, even though the US had made clear they wanted to negotiate that later, according to people familiar with the matter. The Americans have not said that they want to negotiate that later. They've made it clear that they're not going to provide them. But anyway, never mind. And they then said that the officials had told their Ukrainian counterparts in advance of the meeting that Trump wanted to sign an economic partnership this week at a ministerial level. In other words, Zelensky himself would not have signed it, and neither would Trump. We now have that confirmed. And Trump saw the minerals deal as the first phase of a broader economic partnership and told aides it showed the United States was effectively making a commitment. Because the agreement deal would mean the United States had a vested interest in Ukraine's economic security. The Guardian, as I said, phrases this differently, but that's actually what Trump said, and he made his position there perfectly clear. The officials believed that all had been communicated to Ukraine, as was the advice that senators gave Zelensky on Friday morning to praise Trump and not litigate the issue of wanting stronger security guarantees to his face. To Trump's aides, Zelensky did not heed that advice when he expressed skepticism at J.D. Vance's view of making peace with Russia and, in their views, lectured the United States president on the history of Russia's aggression towards Ukraine that started in 2014 with the annexation of Crimea. So, as I said, all of these comments originate with the Starmer government. You can see, as I said, how some things have been adjusted around. But it shows that Starmer and his people know that the Americans are furious with Zelensky, that Zelensky had been told in advance by the Americans what he should say when he came to the White House and what he should not say, and that Zelensky infuriated the Americans by disregarding all that advice. And yet we read, and I've read elsewhere, in The Guardian again, that after this titanic quarrel in the Oval Office, what did Starmer do? He telephoned, he worked the phones, he spoke to Zelensky, he tried to get Zelensky to go back to the White House. Apparently it was his idea, not originally Zelensky's at all, that Zelensky should go back to the White House and sign the minerals extraction deal. Despite the rage that existed in the White House at that time. And then Starmer telephoned the White House and tried to get them to agree to accept Zelensky. And of course, the people at the White House said a blunt and emphatic no. So why is he doing all of this? Why is he leading Britain into this position where he's neglecting the government of Britain itself, giving all of this time to Zelensky, embracing him, as I said, in Downing Street, acting as his advocate in telephone calls to the Americans. Does he not see how risky for Britain, if not only for himself, doing all this actually is? I am at a loss to understand it, but anyway, there it is. It's all for him. Anyway, we will see what comes out of this meeting in London today. As I said, it's becoming increasingly clear to me, incidentally, that gradually the focus, the key player in all Ukraine-related matters is becoming Starmer rather than Macron. Macron obviously has many political problems in France. His position in France is inherently unstable. He no longer has a stable support in the French Parliament, and he's also deeply unpopular in France. Starmer is not very popular in Britain. In fact, he's becoming less popular, though it's possible that this spat over Ukraine might have boosted his popularity slightly. But, well, I suspect that nonetheless his popularity will continue to go downwards before very long. But at least he has a big majority in the House of Commons, and he seems even more obsessive about Ukraine than all the other European leaders are. He's signed 100-year treaties with the Ukrainians. He's told he's gone against the Americans by telling the Ukrainians that they're on an irreversible course against NATO, towards NATO. He's advocated for the Ukrainians to the Americans. He's tried to get Zelensky back in the White House after the Americans threw him out. A fool's errand. He embraces him outside Downing Street, and he's trotting out again this exhausted idea of sending peacekeeping forces to Ukraine and extracting security guarantees, which the Americans don't want to give. Now, the Americans are not going to impose sanctions on Britain. I think the Trump administration is very tired of sanctions, but they can do all kinds of other things. Tariffs, for example. Trump is already talking about heavy tariffs against Europe. Up to now, he's avoided doing so against Britain. It would be a devastating blow to the British economy if the United States started to move towards tariffs against Britain. I'm not saying it's going to happen, but Starmer is behaving dangerously for a cause I simply cannot understand. Anyway, let's move on from Starmer. Let's quickly talk about what is going on with the Russians, because the Russians have not just, we haven't just had statements from Lavrov about peacekeepers. The Russians have now said quite a few things, actually, about the state of relations with the United States. They provided a detailed statement now about the Istanbul talks, which took place on Friday. They've confirmed that the talks went well. The statement has appeared now on the Russian Foreign Ministry's website. They say that the discussions centered on normalizing the operation of diplomatic missions of both countries, building upon recent bilateral engagements at the highest and high levels. They say that joint measures were agreed upon to ensure the unfettered mutual financing of Russian and US diplomatic missions operations, and to establish appropriate conditions for diplomats to fulfill their official duties. The Russians also say that they brought up the topic of the Russian diplomatic properties which were seized in the United States between 2016 and 2018. The Russians say illegally, though the Russians do not say whether the Americans gave any ground on that. And then the Russian readout says that the necessity of achieving tangible outcomes to foster conditions conducive to improving bilateral relations in the interests of both nations was underscored. In particular, the American side was encouraged to consider the restoration of direct air service between the two countries. An interesting idea. It's the first time that the Russians have actually suggested that one particular sanction be lifted, direct airline flights between Russia and the United States. That would be an easy thing to do, and for all I know, it might come. And then the Russians say that the discussions proceeded in a substantive and business-like manner, with both parties agreeing to continue dialogue through this channel. So my concerns about the Friday meeting were misplaced. It seems as if it was a successful meeting. They're going to unblock the problems of financing for their respective embassies. And we now know who led the two delegations that met in Istanbul. One was the director of the Russian Foreign Ministry's Department of North America, Alexander Darchiev, and he apparently, it is now confirmed, will be Russia's new ambassador to the United States. The American team, by the way, was led by Deputy Assistant Secretary of State, Senator Coulter. Anyway, so that was a successful meeting after all, and apparently Trump himself was pleased with the progress of the meeting. However, the Russians have warned that there's not going to be a quick improvement in US-Russia relations, and TASS quotes Peskov on this. The range of possible topics for cooperation between Russia and the United States should be outlined now, but quick measures should not be expected. Answering a question about possible cooperation on rare earth metals, Peskov pointed to the position of the US side, which notes that first a settlement around Ukraine, then the economy. It seems to me that even now we need to outline the range of possible topics for cooperation, but we should not expect any quick results in this area right now. So the Russians say all of this is going to take time. We're going to move forward step by step towards normalizing and improving relations. First, let's get the embassies sorted. Then maybe the next stage is to restore air links. And that will be very interesting. It'll mean that American airlines can fly to Moscow and Russian airlines can fly to America again. It'd be very interesting to see what the Europeans say about that. The European airlines are suffering heavy losses because they cannot overfly Russia to access East Asia, putting them at a disadvantage against Asian airlines. It could be that the Europeans will not be European airlines will now, if the Americans lift these restrictions, that the European airlines will be extremely unhappy if those restrictions aren't lifted as well. Lastly, I will quickly touch on the military situation in Ukraine. The first thing to say is that Radovka, the Russian newspaper, has basically pushed back against claims that the Ukrainians have conducted successful counterattacks in Toretsk and Kotlino. They claim that Kotlino, near Pakrovsk, remains under Russian control. I'm not there, let me stress, I don't know. But that's what Radovka said. And Radovka also said that there were raids by the Ukrainians into Toretsk. These were small scale. They didn't alter the basic situation in Toretsk. They were essentially a PR maneuver to accompany Zelensky's disastrous trip to the United States. About that, I suspect that that is true. The big story on the battlefields in Ukraine, it's twofold, in fact, as far as I can see. The first is that the Russians continue to advance on a broad front, step by step, towards the Dnieper. They're advancing from the Velikaya Novosilka and also further north. There doesn't seem to be much in the way of an organized Ukrainian resistance to that advance. But the other big story, the really big story, is in Kursk region. There is no doubt that the Russians have now obtained fire control, as it's called, over the main supply road linking the Ukrainian city of Sumy with Sudzha, the one town that the Ukrainians still have in Kursk region. It seems that the Russians are now preparing an assault on that long contested village of Malaya Lokhnya. If the Russians capture it, they will have further shrunk the perimeter around Sudzha itself. And, well, to say it frankly, we are now very close, it seems to me, to the Ukrainian troops in Sudzha being effectively trapped. There's word that with the ground turning muddy again, the Ukrainians are in a critical position because they can only use the roads to retreat across and to supply their troops. And of course, the roads now are, well, not fully closed, but they've become very dangerous because of Russian drones and shelling and that kind of thing. So the battle in Ukraine goes on. The primary Russian objective at the moment, it seems to me, is to complete the encirclement of Sudzha and defeat the Ukrainians in Kursk. And who knows, they may be just a few weeks away from that point. Well, this is where I finished today's program. More from me soon. Let me remind you again, you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar and by going to our shop. Links under this video. Last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. Thank you again. More from me soon. Have a very good day.